We're going to go ahead and get started here. In this room this morning, we're going to have a session called Why Trees Die and What We Can Do to Help Them. So if this is where you need to be, stay here. If you're looking for the other session, it'll be upstairs. My name's Matt. I'm going to be introducing Steve Gabriel today. And it's a pleasure. I've had kind of a huge agroforestry crush on Steve for a lot of years. Learned a lot from Steve. So I'm going to introduce him here. Steve Gabriel is an ecologist, farmer, educator, and consultant, grateful to be living and stewarding lands as Wellspring Forest Farm in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. Throughout his career, Steve has taught and consulted with thousands of farmers and land stewards on a wide range of agricultural practices, including water management, agroforestry, silvopasture, and mushroom cultivation. He also collaborates on agroforestry work with the Farming with Trees Collective, which I hope you check out because it's super cool. At Wellspring Forest Farm, Steve and his family steward about 25 acres of land in a lifelong practice of restoring healthy water, soil, and forests. The farm produces mushrooms, pastured lamb, maple syrup, and nursery trees, while offering a demonstration site for regenerative farming practices. Steve co-authored Farming the Woods in 2014 and is author of Silvopasture, released in 2018. He previously worked for 12 years with the Cornell Small Farms Program as extension specialist, focusing on mushroom and agroforestry systems. So Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. All right. Can you hear me all? Everybody? Thanks for coming this morning. So the session is going to be a little talk and a little interactive. So hopefully you're up for not just sinking into your chair and dozing off, because we're going to have some conversation. A lot of my interest in this topic is, having admittedly killed a lot of trees and felt really bad about it, I wanted to understand and think about it in a deeper way and have conversation around that so we can all do a little bit better. So it's been a exploration of mine, and we're engaging a lot with some of our projects now in conversation to really just think this through. So a lot of the sessions so far in the conference have really dove into a lot of details around agroforestry, and we're going to try to zoom out a little bit and look at kind of agroforestry in this bigger sense and just think about trees in kind of that macro sense of things. So the QR code there, if you don't mind, this is some of this information collection I'm hoping to do today will feed into the grant. And if you can fill out this quick little survey, I'd love to collect y'all's info just to have a little bit of information about who's in the room and some of your perceptions of trees. We'll get some more in the session. And then at the end, sort of as I digest all of this information after the conference, I'll share it back out with folks who want to share their email. So if that's of interest to you, use that QR code, or it's just farmingwithtrees.org, and you can find the link for why trees die. And there's a survey link there too as well. And then I'm going to talk a lot about with a lot of sort of, I'm going to feed a lot of resources at you and papers and things like that. So they're all linked on that web page as well, if you want to dig deeper and read into it some more. So let's get going here. If it works. Uh-oh. There we go. So I just want to start with a little bit of appreciation and thanks. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share. Appreciate you all for coming. Appreciate the Savanna Institute for hosting and facilitating, really building a lot of scaffolding around agroforestry organizing. I went to the first North American Agroforestry Conference about 18 years ago. And there was a lot of conversation about someday people will be interested in this. Someday the government will pay attention. Maybe there'll even be some funding to do this. But for now, we're just going to be little nerds in the corner, kind of talking about trees and hoping that day comes. And it's really exciting to see it in this just emerging phases of blossoming, right? We're really early on in that, but there's attention is now being paid to it. So it's really exciting. And I appreciate Savanna's role in creating some of the structures needed to advance it in a really good way. I also just want to appreciate and give thanks for the land and all the living things, because we're here in a conference and we're separated from the earth by a lot of layers of concrete, I think. And we're talking about all these things that are actually out there that I come from, that we're going to go back to, and that are actually why we do the work is being connected to those landscapes, right? So the trees, the soils, all the organisms in there, the animals, the birds, the waters, these are the reasons we're actually doing the work, is to cultivate and support those things and be in relationship to them. And then I want to also thank all the folks that have shared knowledge, some of you in this room, and we've been engaged in good conversation, sharing wisdom, sharing knowledge, teachers in my life, teachers in all of your own lives that have contributed to your understanding and in some way have helped you arrive here today. Knowledge is not something that anyone owns. It's something that we share and exchange, right? So just in appreciation for all these things, I want to bring forward some of the thinking that we're going through, some of the work that's coming out of the grant projects we're involved with, and just engage in some conversation with y'all and see where we land. And by the way, this is one of my favorite mushrooms. It's called Mycena. It's one of the most ubiquitous mushrooms worldwide. There's over 600 subspecies of Mycena. And it's recently been discovered, although that might just be because we're really far behind, that it's made this evolutionary leap, because forever scientists have assumed it's a decomposing mushroom. And they're finding now it's actually also a mycorrhizal mushroom that's starting to show up and penetrate the roots of trees and form those connections and cycle those nutrients and materials. And that's remarkable, because we've been trying to put mushrooms in these categories and they just keep jumping out all the time. And it does all those things, and yet if you find these in the woods, they're called little bonnet caps. They're the tiniest little beautiful mushrooms that if you don't stop and look, you'll miss, right? So really good metaphor for, I think, some of the things we need to think about when we look at more networked situations and with agroforestry. So just down the road from me, I'm in central New York. I'll talk a little bit about where I come from. Is my mentor, Forester Mike DeMunn. Dahadanya is his Seneca name, which means he who protects the forest. And I've been blessed. I started learning with Mike during my final undergrad work. 2010 is when I met him, and I was lucky to be able to do an independent study. And basically the class was I followed him around in the woods for a semester and learned from someone who just spoke the language of the woods. And there's no better education than that experience. And so this quote's from him. We continue to work as friends and as colleagues today and visit each other often. And his woods is just a remarkable place where he's done thinning, he's done timber harvests, and you wouldn't even know it. The forest is always better than you found it. He's done this all over the region. And he's also worked for the U.S. Forest Service. He's also worked for large lumber companies and lumber mills. So he's really been bridging these different worlds. And on the website for this talk, there's a nice video that features Mike if you want to hear more from him. So what he says is, when I go into the woods, I always let it talk to me. I listen to it. I look around and at everything it has to tell me, because this is the home of the trees and the animals, not ours. And the actions I do have grave consequences. So he's just up the road from me, our little pin there. So these are the two watersheds that we are closest to, although there's a third one below us. You can see we're right at the southern tip of Lake Cayuga and that watershed. So our land all drains to the north and down into Toggenot Creek and over Toggenot Falls, which is the tallest waterfall east of the Mississippi. Come visit sometime. Not the largest amount of water, that's Niagara Falls, but the tallest. And then drains northward and eventually up to the St. Lawrence and out that way. If we go half a mile down the road, we are at the top of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and all the water is now draining south towards Maryland. And then if we go a little bit west, we're right on the border of the watersheds of Lake Cayuga and Lake Seneca, the two largest Finger Lakes. And that line that separates those two watersheds is roughly considered the traditional homelands of, and sort of the territorial boundary of the Seneca and the Cayuga Nations, which are two of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And right along that line, maybe a little bit more to the west, was where Sullivan's campaign marched right up between the Finger Lakes, and Sean Sherman talked about that yesterday, and destroyed a lot of these really advanced agricultural systems, settlements, and people. So we live in a landscape that has a lot of rich history of early America and has gone through a lot of different changes like any other place in the US, but certainly was more or less completely, deforested and Now we're in a state where a lot of it's grown back, but it's in this sort of awkward teenage phase, and there's a lot of different dynamics going on. And so we find ourselves here trying to think about our context and work with that. And our farm, this list is all the things we kind of work on, but kind of from top to bottom, things that are a little more of an economic or sort of an income source versus things that we do for family, friends, community, and in a hobby sense. But I think a farm, one of the things, I worked for small farms for 12 years, and I regret always saying, things need to really be couched in economic terms all the time. I think some farm activities don't fit the economic paradigm, but they fill other needs. So maple syrup is a great example. We don't have access to enough trees to scale to make it economical, but we love the process. It's a really rich, unique process for our part of the world, for this part of the world. It's something for us to be connected to the seasons, to witness rapidly changing dynamics with climate change, and to kind of feel all those things, and also just to connect our kids to nature. There's no better way than to give them sugar, right? Than to connect them to something. So that's kind of fallen into more of a community. We share that process with multiple families as we steward the landscape. And so we do mushrooms. We have a yurt and a straw bale cabin that we rent out because we have a lot of folks coming through. Finger Lakes are really known for like sort of wine country and things like that. And we do education, and we just kind of play with these different systems. A lot of it couched in this idea of being a forest farm, that we want to leave a forest in our footsteps rather than the sort of cleared, beaten down, compacted, nutrient depleted soils that we found ourselves on when we arrived. So we want to leave a forest behind. And that's an open-ended question, what that looks like, what that actually means. But that's our overall vision. And so in addition to doing that, we got a grant, and we've been collaborating with different organizations. So if you go to farmingwithtrees.org, in addition to some of the resources from this talk, we have a really wonderful series of videos. It was funded by the National Agroforestry Center. Thank you so much. And we collaborated with the Regenerative Design Group out of Massachusetts and Costa Boutsikaris, a really wonderful filmmaker. Did a bunch of case studies of different examples of silvopasture in the Northeast. And they're just really beautiful, exceptional, lovely things to watch as well as learn from. And more recently, we're working on this Farmer Tree Skills Grant. And so we're trying to talk and engage with both the farming community and then also nursery producers to really understand needs and perceptions around trees. And we're taking a lot of time to do that. And we're finding a ton of value in not just putting programs into practice, but actually just having conversations. So we're doing more and more of those that'll lead towards curriculum and training. And eventually we actually have some funding that we can put forth into some projects, but we're letting that all kind of emerge. So coming up, we're doing an initial tree nursery intensive. If you're in the Northeast, perhaps you know somebody. We have a couple slots left. So if anyone wants to join, we're just going to have a really good time touring different nurseries and talking trees, nerding out about that. So that's a little background and where I come from. So let's get into the meat of it here. So why do trees die? Well, first of all, because they do. It's how nature designs these things to happen. So when I moved back to the Ithaca area, I was lucky to hook up with Ken Mudge at Cornell, and he let me audit his forest farming class because I wasn't an enrolled student. And that's how we ended up writing Farming the Woods together. But one of the folks that came to that class was Peter Smallage, who's the state extension forester. And this was really early on in the journey of just, I love woods, I like trees, I want to do something. I'm not interested in sort of traditional forestry, timber management. That's not where my passion is, but I don't know really what it is. And so this idea of forest farming, agroforestry just kind of piqued my interest. One of the things he said is, if you think about an acre of land in the temperate climate, Mother Nature draws upon this vast seed bank, seed that's both in the soil, that's coming in because birds are flying over and pooping it out, and it's coming in through the wind and through water, hopefully through humans and animals as well, but it's drawing upon this massive seed bank, maybe 100,000 seeds per acre, to grow its forest. And out of those 100,000 seeds, maybe 10,000 will actually sprout and try to start that early process of growing into a tree, and maybe 1,000 of those will actually become saplings. And that'll end up being a mature canopy of maybe 100 or 200 trees at the end of its life cycle, which is over several centuries we're talking about here. And this is how Mother Nature plants trees, right? And that's a pretty low survival rate, right? We can definitely do better when we select, when we care for trees in a nursery, when we care for them during planting. We can greatly increase those odds. But we have to know just that by design, that's part of the process. And so how do we integrate that into how we design our agroforestry systems is a good question. This is from, Brett's going to talk in the next session, and we went to Angus Glen Farm. I've been there many times. If you're ever in the area, it's a great visit. Really advanced silvopasture system with Angus beef cattle. And this was a picture from a farm walk we did. I don't even know if you know, Brett, what year this was, but you'd just done this thinning. And we were looking at the stump of these trees that had been thinned, and then this tree cookie is from a tree cut nearby. Same species, same soil, same growing conditions, and same age all at the same time, right? So tree size does not tell us about age. We see in that natural selection process that winnows these things down, all of the growth characteristics and the genetic potential of these trees kind of express themselves. And there's no way to know until we let that play out, which can be over hundreds of years, really, right? So why do trees die? Well, they die also because the opportunity for us to like pull upon the genetic wealth that is out there is really limited in terms of the nursery sector. So this is a map from an article and a paper through the University of Vermont that looked at availability of tree stock for mostly conservation planting, but it really applies to agroforestry as well. Looking at both the quantity of seedlings available and the quality of those seedlings, where that seed source is coming from. And so the reds are where there's no diversity, there's no real seed being collected en masse to propagate trees. This was a specific map for red oak as an example. So in New York State, there's basically no red oak being actively collected and propagated and available. We all want red oak. We're often ordering it from the Midwest. That's where it's showing up. That's where we can find the genetics. And there may be nothing wrong with that, but we certainly have a lot of potential work to do. And we're missing a lot of opportunity of those trees that are out in the landscape that have that deep knowledge and deep adaptability, and yet aren't available to us if we want to plant more diverse genetics in the future. Why do trees die? Well, they die because we don't plan very holistically. And we're sort of forced to not plan holistically by many programs where our experience on our farm, we've leveraged a lot of funding. We've worked with NRCS. There's a lot of positives to it, but it's also challenging because we're often asked to ignore parts of the land or ignore layers in that part of the land and just focus on this one thing. And we start to kind of cookie cutter up the landscape. And often we're stuck to having more conversations about how to get the paperwork in than like what our design goals are or what our values are. And so I have background in training in permaculture design, and one of the valuable contributions it brings is a real clear design process that's more holistic and more integrated into the landscape, and really starts with the human element, really starts with listening to the land, tries to bring that to the table before, refining it down into a design. So why do trees die? Well, because if we get these plans going, the funding doesn't often cover that planning piece, the actual installation of the trees, and rarely aftercare. At best, it usually covers some of number two, some of the planting, but it rarely covers all the planting. That table is an estimated cost per tree from a project we were involved with. We were hired by a company who buys organic pastured chicken eggs in New York, mostly works with Mennonite farmers. They wanted to pilot a project to see the feasibility of putting trees on these chicken farms, and mainly to get the chickens out in the pasture more, because they weren't actually utilizing much of the pasture because they were scared of getting picked off by a hawk or something, right? And so it was a social science experiment as much as an ecological one to look at the farmer perceptions around tree planting when they hadn't really been exposed to that in many cases. Trees belong in the hedgerow or not at all in the field. And also just ecologically, because these were larger chicken houses and a lot of the soil around these barns was very compacted, a very tough place to plant trees. So it was a good experiment, but we did try to keep the data and estimate what our cost per tree was in terms of planting. Usually we see folks talk about $1 per tree or $4 per tree, maybe $10 a tree, but we were finding in this case, maybe on a smaller scale, $26, $30 a tree was our cost. There's ways to get that down. It wasn't a perfect process, but it's hard to take care of those trees when you don't have the cost to cover them supported. And then finally, why do trees die? Well, large scale initiatives, and this is a global phenomenon, tend to focus on how many trees get in the ground and how excited we are about that, but rarely are they more than a one-time event. And rarely do they actually involve the participation of the local community to have buy-in, both in the planning and the implementation. And so those groves of trees often get neglected, ignored, and then die out. And this is a really persistent phenomenon. So while agroforestry is new in the US, tree planting is not new. Humans have tried to plant a lot of trees en masse and not done a very good job. Maybe done slightly better than nature, but not too much. And so this is a really great paper to read up on that. And these folks offer some really good recommendations to kind of dig into that. But that's kind of on that larger scale. So if these are some of the big picture reasons why trees die, then the question is, well, how do we help? How do we increase survivability while accepting that it's not going to be 100%? It's going to be something less than that, but something better than maybe where we find ourselves today. So we're going to kind of break it out into these different buckets. I'll talk about a few, and then I'm going to have you all break out and have some conversations with some different activities to further kind of sort out some of the pieces of this. Actually, one of them is coming up real soon, so get ready. So please stand up. So I'm going to ask you, you can sort of stay in the area here for this one. And when I post a question, I'm just going to have you find someone, ideally someone you don't know yet, and just have a conversation. I'm going to give about 2 or 3 minutes per question, and I'm going to ring this chime when it's time to stop. And I'll ask you just to stop, and then we're going to do a couple rounds of this, and then we'll move on. All right. So, everybody ready? Good. So just find a person, answer the question, talk to each other. All right. So first question: growing up and in your family, what is a story about your relationship to trees? Okay, go. So we're talking about paradigms. Why did I ask these questions? Why is it important to start with these questions? I recently came across this term I wasn't familiar with, biophilia, which is the love of life in the living world and the affinity of human beings for other life forms. And I think it's pretty safe to say that if folks take time out of their day and gather and talk about trees, they're pretty obsessed, they're pretty in love with them in one way or the other, however you want to think about that. And if we don't start from this place, if we don't acknowledge and start from that place of something we love and care for, just like we love and care for families and children and dogs and livestock and whatever else, trees, we won't protect them, right? We won't make sure they're okay all the time. If we treat them as objects, if we think about them as fixtures in the landscape to, again, meet a quota of numbers or to produce a certain pounds of things, not that those things aren't part of the equation, but if we don't start from the place of connection and love, I think it's hard to caretake in the way that we want to. So, the number of trees planted is often an important metric for grant reporting. That's certainly something I'm coming across, but it shouldn't be the driving or central thing that we orient our work around. This article is also posted on the website, talks about this very interesting phenomenon where there were several countries trying to compete in the Guinness Book of World Records for who could plant the most trees in the least amount of time. It's a really interesting social experiment just to think about that as a premise for tree planting. It's probably the worst way to plant trees, right? So is it about the number of trees that survived? Well, that's a little bit better than just I planted this many trees. Here's how many survived. But what does survival even mean if we're talking about forests that last for centuries? Because for a healthy forest to survive, some trees should survive for a few years, and some should survive for 10 years, and some should survive for 50, and some should survive much longer. So it comes back to me a lot that it's not about the number of trees, but it's really about the ecosystems. And I don't know where the quote came from. It was sort of in permaculture circles when I was back in those, this idea, we don't plant plants or we don't plant trees, but we plant ecosystems. So we're constantly thinking about trees as an element in an ecosystem. And that's really what's going on here in this sugar maple forest, where we see different ages, we see different stages of growth, we see different layers and levels, different impacts. There's not a lot of regeneration in here because of deer, right? There's a lot of different layers, but that is the ecosystem itself. And sugar maple in particular is something I'm quite fond of. It was really my first entry into farming, into agriculture, into agroforestry, was just connecting to that practice, that beautiful seasonal practice. And one of the things that's really hard to reckon with is that with climate change, we're already seeing and will continue to see a receding population of sugar maples because we're not getting enough cold days for the seed to actually germinate and regenerate. So we're seeing a lot more red maple being persistent. That's also a factor because of logging choices and logging practices, is that red maple is becoming a more dominant species. And I'm learning to love red maple in a different way and appreciate it. It's something you can also tap for sap. But I think a big role of people in my region should be to be collecting maple seed and stratifying it and starting maple trees and planting out that next generation as an act of continuing on the legacy of this tree that's been a real staple in our part of the world for a long time. But that's about planting an ecosystem, not just how many sugar maple seedlings we end up planting into the ground. So how do we do that? And how do we invest in tree planting, not as just one-time events, but as multi-year, multi-generational events? We've been on our farm for 13 years. We've been planting trees every single year. We've lost trees every single year. Trees have died every single year. It's a continuous process, and we're only getting started. And we're certainly better off than when we started with this open, sort of dilapidated hayfield, but it's very early in this forest life, in this forest story, and we don't really know what it's going to look like because we're not ultimately in control of it. So we need to reframe our efforts in that cyclical long-term process. And I don't have good answers, more questions about what that looks like. But if we think of them in ecosystems and we think of them in the time scales that's appropriate, we might get somewhere. And then finally, I think we're successionally in a moment just in this evolution of agroforestry. Again, I said, 15 years ago, we're like, man, I hope somebody pays attention. This stuff's pretty cool. Now people are starting to pay attention, but there's pressure in that to say, we know exactly what's going to happen with these things. We know exactly what combinations of plants and what spacing and what yields we're going to get and all these things. But the reality is we don't. There's nothing that we know. We're learning. People are growing. People are putting really their heart and soul into this. And it's lovely to be surrounded by folks putting energy into it. But we have to just be real. We're in beta phase. We're in beta testing with this stuff, right? And especially with markets. Markets are developing. Markets are growing. Markets are always changing. I can tell you from growing mushrooms and trying to sell them for the last 20 years, the markets never look the same from one year to the next, right? Farmers have to be adaptable to the changing markets. So that's a reality of things. But what does it look like to frame things in, hey, we're in this first phase of testing these things out, trying these things out. And so I think those paradigms are important to bring forward. And it's this idea of we're in a practice, we're practicing for something versus we're perfect at it. We're in perfection mode and we just need to roll it all out like we got it figured out. And I grew up playing the trumpet. One of my favorite trumpet players was Dizzy Gillespie. And I just love this quote. I think it speaks to this. So some days you get up, you put the horn to your chops and it sounds pretty good and you win. Some days you try and nothing works and the horn wins. This goes on and then you die and the horn wins. Right? So we're only on here for this planet for a finite amount of time. And some days our work is going to turn out the way we wanted. Some days it's not. And at the end of it, we're gone and the work stays behind. So that's paradigms. That's some pieces there. Let's talk a little bit about ecology, like what we can learn from nature. So ecology, the root of that is oikos, a Greek word meaning home. This is study of the home, studying the place that we call home. And the more that we make sure we bring these elements in to our tree planting, I think the more we're going to see trees do well and less trees die. So we've already started to talk about this. Most trees die in the landscape. Okay, if that's the case, let's stop thinking about the trees as individuals and start thinking about the community or the ecosystem that evolves out of that. And probably no better effort from a scientific perspective has emerged in recent years than from Susan Simard and all the researchers she's engaged in the Pacific Northwest to really show what this networked beauty of forests really looks like, driven by the mycorrhizal, the fungi communities underneath the ground, where you really start to wonder, like, where does one tree end and the next begin? Where do you draw those boundaries? It's not about the individuals, it's about the community. Some trees must die so that the forest can live. And in that, this is like recent scientifically proven, but this is certainly a perspective held by indigenous cultures the world over for a very long time. So, modern science is just sort of catching up to what many communities have already known. And it shows up in cosmology, it shows up in religion, it shows up in all sorts of different nature-based approaches. So how do we apply some of these things on our farm? Well, if we're thinking about the community, then one of the things we do is we plant our trees really dense, knowing that some are either going to die out or we're going to need to thin them out. And we're in that phase now. Suddenly we're 13 years later. The first 5-6 years, we were just planting trees. Then we started actually needing to manage the wood. And now we're almost managing more wood than we are planting trees, which is a lovely transition to find yourself in. But this is in 2014. This is one of our first rows of black locust we planted. So we're planting them really close together, 2-3 feet apart. This is what they looked like 3 years later. So really satisfying tree, really high survival rate in this case. Good site for them, good seed, good stock. And we've been thinning this out now periodically and really developing what the long-term trees are, and then utilizing the other material for fence posts and for garden trellises and all sorts of different things depending on the diameter. Really productive, just simple system of planting dense and then thinning. So rather than starting out with what we assume the final spacing of our trees is going to be, assuming they all survive, planting dense and then thinning seems to be a really good pattern to think about. Others may be gone so that the few remaining may survive and thrive. Within that, just because a tree is alive or surviving, again, it's not necessarily thriving. It's not necessarily going to reach that, full genetic potential. But that doesn't mean that we have to say, well, that's a trash tree, or that tree isn't worth it. All we care about are the trees that have this massive genetic potential. And probably one of the best examples I've found of that are these Gästgård systems of Sweden. These are livestock fencing systems that are traditionally done by harvesting suppressed spruce trees from the understory of forest, because they value that those tight rings, those 90-year-old trees that are only a few inches in diameter, because they take a longer time to rot. That's just good if you're building a fence. But they also are building these beautiful fences by stacking them, and then they're weaving them with like hemlock and spruce binders, basically, with the knowledge that this fence is also not going to be here forever. This is not a permanent rot-resistant fence. It's going to decompose in the landscape. And what's happened over time is there's now mounds where these fences are being planted from the previous generation's fence that decomposes and builds up the mound, and then the next generation builds a fence, and the process continues. And some of these mounds are 3-4 feet tall. And so it's a way of valuing the parts of the forest that often we diminish and say, that's not a good tree. That doesn't have a purpose or a value. And I really like that idea. And one way that's shown up on our farm is when we make these mistakes, like we put trees in the wrong place and they're not thriving, what's the opportunity in that? So rather than remove them, what can we work with them? And so here on the picture on the right, we planted black locust in this is a different row of black locust in a wet spot. Black locust doesn't like wet feet. We didn't know it was as wet as it was going to be when we planted it. And so they suffered. They're the only actual planting that we have that really has quite a persistent population of locust borer, which is problematic if you want to grow nice locust. And just a few feet away, we see locust that we planted the same year, slightly drier conditions, same soil, that are 2-3 times as tall. So it's a very clear indication of what's going on here. And so rather than say, oops, cut them down, we'll just remove them, do something else, we're transitioning the space. So all those tree tubes are different willow cultivars that we're playing with and researching for tree fodder application for the grazing system. And in the meantime, rather than remove the black locust, we're pollarding them and coppicing them, which is a really scary thing to do the first time you planted and babied all these trees. And now I'm going to go hack them and try to get them to resprout. Just started doing that, but it's really satisfying to come back next year. Some of the regrowth this year, this is a picture from last fall, is there's dozen new shoots, and they're all 6 to 8 feet long, full of lush vegetation that we're pruning and then feeding to our sheep. Amazingly productive from these really marginal trees. And because they're not going to be those long-term trees in our forest ecosystem here, we can play with them, we can use them and learn from them in that sense. And they actually respond better. They're actually healthier than trying to become straight single stem trees that are struggling. We're able to actually rejuvenate them. So it's good for them, it's good for us. So studying ecology, I'm primarily a mushroom farmer. That's the first thing I learned and the first thing I carried forth into farming. And I've always been struck by the knowledge that's emerging that trees and fungi are just inextricably linked and connected. This is a picture of the eastern white pine from the University of Aberdeen, which has done a lot of amazing research around mycorrhizal fungi. So the black, thicker sort of, or I should say the brown, coarser roots are the actual roots of the seedling, All that white mycelium is actually the fungi. And what it does is it wraps around and also sometimes penetrates the root system. And then it moves out into the soil, and then it can increase the root ball of that tree by 75% or more. And mycelium is so finely threaded, it can wrap around individual grains of soil. And it's harvesting nutrients, harvesting water, and bringing that back to the tree, and it's trading it for the sugars, the carbohydrates the tree is replacing, right? This is as old as time, this relationship, as trees evolved in the landscape. And yet most of our trees, where they're coming from and where nurseries are growing them, are often grown, especially at the larger scale, in completely sterile soil, devoid of fungi. Smaller nurseries, more ecological nurseries have a different story, but we're not necessarily focused on that relationship and how we can really make it thrive and hopefully really bring it into our tree planting practice. We're sticking a lot of trees out into fields where there's not healthy fungal communities and asking them to survive, and they don't necessarily have those fungal partners. So part of our initial exploration, I'm curious if anyone else is working on this, I'd love to have conversations around it, is working with what's called indigenous microorganism harvesting and amplifying. And it's really fascinating to me as a mushroom farmer because it's literally a very similar process to how we cultivate mushrooms, going from spore or mycelium up to that finished mushroom. And it involves basically the first stage of the process is identifying an area with healthy soil. What we're doing, this is Brian Caldwell's farm, which is a chestnut farm in our region, one of the oldest chestnut plantings. So we're assuming there's that sort of microbial wisdom in that soil related to chestnut. And we're making these cedar boxes with rice, sterile rice. We put those in the ground for a few days, and this is what shows up. It's pretty wild. This is after 4 days of being in the ground. And I don't know if you can see, but there's this kind of white fluffy mass. That's actually what we're looking for to then harvest and amplify through a 4-stage process to eventually then reapply to seedlings that we're going to start in our nursery. There's also a lot of really colorful molds in there, which is not what we want. So very much in beta testing mode to try to figure out the process, because what we want to see is a nice, clean, full culture of it. But it's really fascinating, the idea of being able to find these legacy stands and then maybe transfer this into the nursery setting so that young seeds or young seedlings are getting exposed to them, and bringing them along with them into the field is really compelling to me. What else can we learn from ecology? Well, one of the things is that trees are not always in a growth phase. They go through a cycle. And just as much time as they spend bursting out and going through growth, they're maintaining and they're putting energy into storage. And then so there's this timing, there's this cycle, and there's energy put into different sectors throughout the season. And that's why we get these differentiation in rings. We get the young ring growth of the tree that's that layer wood, and then that's during the explosive growth in the early part of the season. And then we get that dark ring that's actually the end of the season when senescence and the trees are heading to dormancy. And those two rings together are really what defines the year of a tree's life. So how does that apply to our planting? Well, seasonality and sort of all the dynamics at play, especially with the changing climate, they're increasingly offering lots of challenges to how we plant trees, when we plant trees. I used to assume there was this 4 to 6 week window, and now it's potentially a much longer window. It's potentially a much later window. We don't really know how climate change is going to affect the dormancy patterns of trees. And so thinking about fall versus spring planting, we used to do a lot more fall planting. This is a good example here on this farm. Again, one of the chicken farms, we did a subsoil. And then we planted into the furrows of that. But because it was such an exceptionally wet year, followed by this very intense shift of freezing and thawing and then staying thawed and then going back to freezing, a bunch of trees just popped right out of the soil because there's so much heaving of that soil. Not something we expected in the past when the ground stayed frozen all winter, and we could put those trees in the fall and they'd stay put and be ready to go once the spring, came around. So we're starting to think about staggering our plantings, not lumping them in one part of the year or the other, and really trying to be flexible and dynamic with the realities of the seasons and the realities of what we won't really know until it's actually happening or it's a few weeks out. And then finally, what we know from ecology is that healthy forests go through a mosaic of growth. They shift, they change over time. So the fixed idea we have of an agroforestry system in our mind is just that. It's a fixed idea in our mind, but it's never going to show up like that in the actual landscape. It's going to constantly be changing. And I think one of the best ways to interact and think about that is when we look at our riparian buffers and our riparian zones, because what we found on our farm was a very sort of suppressed and narrow definition of where the riparian area was, where the water should go, And it's always like, no, I'm gonna change that up. I'm gonna shift on you, right? So this is an area that we opened up from some of the overgrown vegetation. We built this settling pool to try to pull out some of the sediment that was washing through. This is upstream from a 3-acre pond that we share with our neighbors that was getting silted in by just a ton of erosion. And that little light blue line is where we originally, dug the channel for it to go into the settling pool. And that lasted for about 2 years. And then the water just said, no, I'm actually going to take a little bit to the right there and go through this meandering, dark blue line here. And now it's changed twice more in the last 2 years because high water events allow it to spill over and make a new pathway. And that's what creeks and rivers and waterways want to do. That's why a buffer is called a buffer, because we need to create space for this water to move into flow. And that's part of this mosaic. So we have to design our riparian areas to work with that. And one of our ongoing research projects, we're really fascinated with willow and all the potential willow. And we're thinking about systems where we can plant willow in what we call willow fodder banks, not places we're going to bring the animals to, but plantings that really help support this kind of meandering and changing, water forest ecosystem. And at the same time, provide really easy ways for us to bundle and harvest and bring willow out to our grazing animals. And willow, if you don't know, is amazing fodder, specifically because of the condensed tannins, which give a lot of benefit to suppressing parasites in the rumen of different grazing animals. It's also high in things like magnesium and zinc and other trace minerals. So really nice tree to work with in the fodder context. And we don't really know about most of these willow species. There's over 400 different species. They're hybridizing all the time. There's all sorts of potential in terms of how fast they grow, how much biomass they produce, how much tannin they have. There's all sorts of questions. So we're really fascinated in trying to figure that out. And this is work that is not going to be done in my lifetime, even just with this one willow species, hence getting the kids involved, hopefully. I mean, this is a nice picture. They only probably worked on this for about 2 minutes and then they're ready to move on to something else. But, and they just love pounding these things in. It's a great project with them, and hopefully getting them invested in that landscape, and hopefully they won't think Dad's just crazy and just too obsessed with trees and I'm going to move on and do something else, but that they want to come back and visit the willow they planted someday, So those are some paradigms, some ecology to bring into the conversation, some things we could build upon. What I want to do is a next activity, and our nice support folks are helping hand out some stickies. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we call this activity the OOPS cluster activity, all right? So you all have probably had experience with trees or seen other experiences with tree planting out there. What I really want you to do is just first take one sticky note and, sorry, I lost my clicker. And just write down one common mistake you've personally made or that you've seen others make when planting trees. Okay, just one. You got to pick one. There's probably many. Pick one, write it down. Try to write it clear and big so people can see it. And when you're done, we're going to head over just to this open space for a minute. And you can wait there until we do our next step. Okay. And if you don't have a sticky or need one, just pop up a hand and someone can help you. Yeah, so we're calling this the OOPS cluster. All right, so the goal here is I'm going to give you a few minutes to find at least like 2, but maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe more people that have the same or very similar mistake to yours. And then when you find them, you're going to cluster together in a little group, and you can just kind of hang out in a little pod, and then we're going to give you a piece of poster paper for your group. You can go find a table. Wait, hold on. Before you start, let me just finish my instructions. Sorry. I'm glad you're enthusiastic to get going. Okay. Once you find your group, I'm going to give you a piece of poster paper, back to your table, and talk about that mistake in particular. And are there either like a paradigm piece or an ecology piece that contributes to that mistake? What can we do to address and like reduce or eliminate this mistake in our tree planting, right? So please jot things on here. I really would love a good note taker for each group, someone to jot, because again, I'm going to harvest this and share it back out as feedback from the session, okay? All right, find your clusters and then get a piece of paper. So the last piece I want to talk about is the planning piece of things and what that could look like what it's looked like a bit for us. Hopefully share a few nuggets of our experience getting trees going and thinking about this, like, how are we going to initiate this? How are we going to sustain this? How are we going to continue to do it for the rest of our lives, essentially, on our farm landscape? And how do we help others? Because a lot of our work is really interested in not just our farm, but the larger community. So in the planning process, to me, and when I work with landowners and farmers, we try to have conversations around like three major elements and allow them to be like a triangle that they all influence each other. And we're looking for a design that satisfies all of them at the same time. And rather than a lot of folks come out and want me to be like, this is the species and the layout and the things you should do. And I'm like, I don't know. We have to let this design solution emerge. It's not about what I think, it's about what shows up when we really ask these questions deeply. So the first is, what are the goals and values of those actually tending to these trees and to this landscape, i.e. the farmers or the land stewards, or however they want to identify. The second being, what does the landscape actually need? What is it telling? Back to what Mike was saying about listening first, seeing what's there, seeing what microclimates and little niches are open and need support, where there's need for restoration. I think agroforestry is best done in the places that need that restoration work. The healthy land can be left alone, at least for the time being. And then what's the context for planting trees locally? That's kind of where the markets piece gets in, if that's a goal of the producer to generate income from one or more of the elements. Like, what does it actually look like? And definitely after working at small farms for 12 years, the biggest thing we found, it didn't matter if it was tree crops or chicken farmers or mushroom farmers or any of them, is time and time again, folks would get really excited about a production practice, and they would produce and they'd figure out all of the kinks and they'd get this really nice, beautiful product. And then they'd have no plans on where it was going, where the market was, what it would look like, and literally livestock farmers I was working with didn't even have the freezer space for their animals. And they're suddenly like, oh crap, what am I going to do with all this stuff? So how do we co-develop the marketing piece with the production piece? And a big thing I've learned about the marketing piece is it's really also back to your goals and values, because the types of marketing and sales you want to do entirely depend on your disposition, how you want to spend your time. Do you like to stand at a farmer's market and smile all day or not? Do you want to slip the package in the back door and sneak away, that sort of thing? So a lot of the funding mechanisms in the programs right now and sort of pieces that are supporting agroforestry often just skip over that or really shortcut it and don't necessarily even have the sort of deeper conversations that need to happen, and the process to allow that to emerge can take some time. We just sort of jump into implementing, right? And then what we call the aftercare or the tending phase, which is, finding some funding usually to support this, getting the tree stock, doing the site prep, planting the trees, and then all the aftercare, which could go on and on and on, right? Of course, over time. And we have these two images here because in each of these, there's a ton of bottlenecks. There's the ways that gets kind of stifled and stuck and slowed down. I'll share a few of those that we're experiencing. And there's a ton of rabbit holes where you sort of get lost and the ground kind of falls out from underneath and you don't feel like there's any clarity around what you're doing. And so you're sort of just free falling through the process. So each of these has that. And that's what we found over time is there's no this is the way to do this thing. It's all very dynamic and very site and context specific. So for us, funding, I always say to folks, if you're new to an area, new to a farm, and is to start reaching out and just like getting to know your NRCS folks, getting to know soil and water, getting to know who's around in the agencies, and not to approach that as like, I need this, I'm going to see if I can get this funding thing, but really just to see if you all connect personally and that there's a clear interest from those folks in helping you get where you want to be. Like, access to this funding, unfortunately, right now is only as good as the person who wants to help you get through the paperwork, really. So we've been really fortunate to have some really amazing NRCS folks in our region who really want to put energy towards agroforestry in particular, and so helping us navigate the very convoluted little sluice of paperwork and bureaucracy and programs and all that kind of thing. Our soil and water district is much less amenable. It just hasn't been happening. They're more interested in working with dairy farms and things like that. And so it's not worth our time to keep, drudging that up. So we have a CSP, conservation stewardship program on our pasture lands. There's been ways that we can set that up, and so it frees up what is called the annual payment. That sort of is a reward for your good conservation practices, and as well as minimize some of the burden of the enhancements that you can do. So there's some sort of interesting ways to orchestrate that have been really helpful for us, and I'm happy to have side conversations more specifically if folks are trying to pursue that. We're in some EQIP programs, so that's environmental quality and incentives program. We started a process to do stream restoration with that 3 years ago, and we're still waiting to get the design approved, right? So, and that's a very common thing is if you're getting into these programs, it's usually a very long lag time from initiation to actualization. And that can be really challenging from a planning perspective and on a lot of fronts. And at the end of the day, sometimes the payments don't even cover your costs for these implementations. So you got to be really careful because you don't want to sign a contract that actually is going to be a net loss if you're not willing to take that on. Right. So if you have good local agents, if you have TSPs who are registered and have done the implementation and can really speak to that, I have a friend who's gone through the forestry TSP, and he can say, yeah, if you sign up for these practices, they're worth it. If you sign up for these, they're not worth it. Those are your allies. Those are the folks you need as navigators, and it can be beneficial. We've gotten a lot of funding support through Northeast SARE, through the farmer grant program. So every region in the US has a SARE program, and I believe all of them have farmer grant programs of various sorts, where you can apply to do more or less a research project on a sort of like research light. It doesn't have to be like super academic. It's like, I have a question about a system that I don't know and I don't want to absorb all the risk. I'd like to be funded, and what I'll do is I'll try this thing out and then I'll tell other farmers about what I learned, is basically what the farmer grant is. So we've done many, and one we did with ducks. We were raising ducks and looking at, could we raise like meat ducks profitably and also use them to help reduce our slug issues in our mushroom yard? It was like, can we do them? Can we put them in an agroforestry system? Can they also provide a good economic return? And what we found is like, yes, but not at the scale we wanted to do. So, you know, we needed to raise 300-400 ducks to make the profit margins work. Wasn't what we were interested in, but we shared what we learned with folks. We made this little guide about raising ducks on a small agroforestry farm, if you want to dig that up. Love ducks, love geese, they're great. So SARE's a great resource. And then we're just recently enrolled in PASA Sustainable Agriculture, based in Pennsylvania, has a grant program in the Climate Smart Commodities grant called Climate Smart Farming. And so there's a number of practices they're supporting with a payment system. Agroforestry is one of those, and those are available everywhere on the East Coast, from like Maine to South Carolina. Folks can be enrolled, and it's a so far a really lovely process, good program, and it's actually giving us access to NRCS. It all kind of funnels back through NRCS, but they're able to access funding for practices that our local NRCS can't. So in New York State, we're not allowed to apply for silvopasture funding because it's not a state-approved practice, but through PASA we can, and this is like a huge gift to us because we've been doing this work on our own dime for years, and suddenly we actually have support to really move on this, and it's really exciting. It really is pushing the lever, so it's great. So if you're in those regions or working with folks in those regions, definitely check them out. In terms of tree stock, I think we've acquired tree stock from just about every possible thing, sort of source out there in the world. Our nursery evolved out of just a need to have a place to hold our trees, because we did this thing for many years. Super guilty. Like I usually call it winter catalog syndrome, where you get like all the tree and seed catalogs and you're like sitting back and kind of taking it easy. And you're like, that looks good. And that looks good. And I suddenly put in a $500 order and then I forget about it. And then the trees show up in April and I haven't even figured out where they're going. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay. It's okay to admit it. It's fine. We're all guilty, right? But so putting in holding beds and having capacity for that has been really helpful. And then also, like, our state nursery has really good seed source, but the trees are really low quality. The root systems are very poorly developed. So we realized over time it's a really cheap way to access some local seed genetics, but we actually have to bring them into the nursery and grow them out for 1 or 2 years. They're not ready for the field. And really, the nursery is just like a nursery for humans or any other animal. It's a place to caretake a bunch of trees really easily until they're ready to go out into the world. Right. And so whether that's often couched as like, oh, I'm going to start a nursery because it's a business. But I think if it's an agroforestry farm, a nursery should be part of that farm, just like you need a water system, just like you need infrastructure for any of your animals. It's an essential part just to have that holding space. And especially with a changing climate and all the unknowns, it's really handy to have a space to say, you know what, the situation isn't right. The weather's not right. I'm going to hold these trees until I can plant them when things change. Or I just hurt myself. I can't actually do this ambitious planting project I thought. I need to rest and I need to plant, move my planting dates to a different time. So, and then I think from there you start to have a nursery, and then you just suddenly also have way more trees than you know what to do with. And that's where a lot of nursery businesses, we were talking to a lot of nursery folks in the Northeast for this grant project. And a lot of them were like, yeah, I just started a nursery to sell plants because I had too many and I didn't know what to do with them. For site prep, there's again, so many rabbit holes and so many options, but the timing of this and the sequencing of this is really important. And it's usually challenging to do the site prep and then plant right away. It's often something that's better done a season or a 6-month time window, before everything else goes on. So this is an example of one of our plantings where we used a BCS walk line tractor with a rotary plow just to dig a furrow. Essentially, it just hollows out a furrow and mounds the soil. And then we could go back in and plant. What I like about that is it's basically creating a really nice wide trench for those initial feeder roots of the tree to spread out. And we can compare that to a lot of folks use an auger to plant trees. And that's a straight, narrow, confined, deep hole, which is helpful for taprooted trees, but a lot of trees want to spread out. And so if it's a really narrow hole that goes down, it's really hard to get them in there. And then on the right side, this is actually part of that riparian area that I showed previously, where this spring we rented a skid steer with basically a very heavy duty brush cutter on the front, and shredded this stuff because it was basically dead and it was not thriving in here. And what I love about those is it has an impact on the landscape, but it basically mulches all those trees and creates this really fertile bed. And now we're going in and planting that. It's pre-mulched. So in areas that we need to make it that more drastic shift, there's not a lot of healthy vegetation. It could be a really good way, but we needed to let it sit again after that before we could actually get the trees in. So we're still waiting a bit. Proper planting, again, trees really want to spread out in their initial years, especially more than down. So the more you can get them space is good. 3 times the width of the root structure is ideal, and 1.5 times the depth. And there's different ways to think about, if we track that back to what kind of tree stock are we getting, what kind of tree stock are we growing out, can we optimize the size of that initial root structure for the hole that we can actually dig, whether that's by hand or with some type of machinery or a tractor setup or something like that. And I love digging trees by hand. I think a lot of it sometimes comes down to just the practice and the technique. A lot of folks are like, yeah, this is really hard. And then you look at their shovel and it hasn't been sharpened in 20 years. And they don't have the right thing. And so this is really hard. And it's yeah, it's really hard to dig a hole with a spoon, basically, right? I love this Jim Gem KBC bar for our heavy clay soils. It's actually a really pleasurable tool to work with. And that in combination with a tree spade is what allows us to do a lot of tree planting by hand. That is an enjoyable thing when we take the time to do it. For protection, we've tried all sorts of tree tubes and heavy duty wire and all kind of the whole gamut of things. Again, it depends on context. It depends on time. We're really playing now with a 3D fence that we're actually putting on the perimeter of the farm rather than focus on individual trees. It's always more cost effective if you can fence out groups of trees. And this is from a lot of folks use 3D fences in the hunting community to establish deer plots. And so to keep deer out. And the idea is that you're creating these double strands and preventing the deer from sort of making that leap. They're not 100% foolproof by any means. And I don't think they're going to work in areas that are super high deer density. We have kind of a moderate deer density, but we're mostly able to keep up with that. And it's a very cost-effective way. And we're able to just put these little short tree tubes around to protect from burrowing rodents and also protect the trees, because we do a lot of just weed whacking with our electric weed whacker to keep the vegetation down. That's working really well for us. So just to wrap up, there's all these great possibilities with paradigm, with ecology, with planning that can help us with trees and increasing the number that survive and thrive. But at the end of the day, a lot of this also comes down to some luck and some unknowns and some pieces that we're just going to have to keep playing with. So of course, we're going to plan for those unknowns as best we can. This is a swale system that we designed for a 5-inch rain event. We've had 3 of those since we put the swale in. But I'm already thinking about, I know that's going to be exceeded at some point. We're going to get more than 5 inches of rain. Where's that water going to go? What does that look like? So this is a short-term cork in the bottle, but there's going to be a long-term system that's going to continue to need to evolve. We should always be learning and open to that learning. I love these quotes about risking. It's only when you risk failure, you discover things. When you play it safe, you're not expressing it. You're not expressing the utmost of your human experience. So we need to take risks. We need to try bold things. Keep in mind that we're in that beta testing phase. And just be honest about what we know and what we don't know. If knowledge is power, knowing what we don't know is wisdom. And then finally, cultivating humility in all this. If anything that farming has taught me, it is to be humble and not to assume I know what's going on, because it always comes up and goes. And this pile here is a pile of our oyster mushroom bags they're made of organic straw. This summer was a really humbling experience. I've been growing mushrooms for 20 years and kind of thought I got this stuff pretty figured out. And we had this incredible bacterial outbreak, which can happen in indoor systems and just spread like wildfire. And so very humbling experience to reckon with that, to suffer the economic loss of that. And that is part of farming, right? And so Thich Nhat Hanh says that humility involves letting go of knowledge, looking with fresh eyes, listening with fresh ears, and just not striving for perfection. And so this is a practice. It's something to work on. It's something to continue on a journey with. So I have one more request. You should have a few more stickies on your table. I would love a little feedback from the talk and for the project as a whole. So if you have one idea or feeling that sticks with you after the session today, that would be one sticky. And then one question that's still something you're thinking about when tending trees. So I'd love you to take a minute to do that. And thanks so much for coming to the session. And I'll just say, if you didn't get to fill out the survey or wanted to access any of the additional resources from the talk, the website and the QR code are there as well.